A couple of us are really shattered from last week, so if we start rambling, you know why. So I was in Working Group 1 and Working Group 2, so I had a double shift in the whole process, because in the previous assessment reports I was in Working Group 1 and I ran away because I found it boring. And Working Group 1's messages are interesting, but they're pretty much the same. Working Group 2, I think, is where the center of gravity is, because everybody's suddenly realizing that climate change is a done deal. Nobody's disputing it. And so I titled this A Change of Mindset, because to me, what was most remarkable about the plenary meeting last week was that not a single government disputed the science of climate change. There was just no contestation of the science of climate change. And that was amazing, given going back to, for example, 2001, I can remember Saudi Arabia delegation there with 3 hired guns from the international legal community really arguing vociferously that climate change was not real and trying to water it down as much as possible. So there's a real flip in mindset around that. That table up there is just a little bit of a extract from our chapter 21, which looks at the confidence in observed and projected changes. And that is the context behind everybody's thinking at the meeting. Everybody was aware that we're seeing the changes already. It wasn't some hypothetical future. And so this really permeated the discussion. And I put there the topic of risk permeated everything. If you look at the report and average the number of times you find the word risk, it's about 5 times per page through the report. And risk really did permeate the discussions and was the flavor around which everything was hanging. So our chapter 21, is a little bit of an odd chapter. It started with a blank sheet. Nobody had any idea what it was supposed to do. It was called Regional Context. And it was supposed to interface between Working Group 1 and Working Group 2, as well as interface between Working Group 2 and Working Group 3, as well as interface between the first part of the report, which, if you don't know, comes in 2 parts. First part is sectorally based, and the second part is regionally based. And we had this task of trying to interface between the two. It took a long time to get a storyline together out of this, what we were supposed to be doing, but I'm quite happy with the end. We're really just bringing forward the conceptual ways of approaching the regional information and how we use regional information. And we have a number of headline messages, for example, contested definitions and alternative approaches to describing regional vulnerability to climate change pose problems for interpreting vulnerability indicators. And this was an emergent message that came out of a lot of the literature. So we had fun on the project, on the chapter, but I think what I really want to do is just talk a little bit about last week, because it really was unusual. So there's some pictures taken from the plenary. I'm not sure we're allowed to take pictures, but anyway. The top left-hand one was 2 o'clock in the morning, still going. And it was amazing. Every night we started talking about the night shift, because it went through to 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock each morning, just because it was going so incredibly slowly. And the reason it was going slowly was not because people were contesting the science. They were contesting what are the important ways of describing the science for their particular regions. So on day 1, for example, I think we did about half a page on day 1. And a lot of the initial hiccups were around one country, I suppose I can name the country, Bolivia, wanting to insert the words Mother Earth in the language. And I was blown away with this. I didn't know what was going. Why do you want to put Mother Earth in a scientific report? And it's because the indigenous population in Bolivia is really setting the mindset of the country, and for them it's really important to have that phrase in there. Now, of course, IPCC only reports what is in the literature and what's been assessed in the literature, and so we didn't have Mother Earth in the final document. But it was a real indicator of what is going on. And another just brief anecdote was, actually, I'll tell that one just now. So the top right-hand figure there, that one figure took a whole morning to dispute through that. And again, nobody's disputing the science. Now, I had responsibility for the left-hand half of the figure, and other chapters had responsibility for the right-hand. And everybody focused on the right-hand, which made me relieved, because I expected a lot of challenges on the science of the left-hand figure. And nobody raised anything about the left-hand panel. On the right-hand panel, we had a real dispute, because Saudi Arabia, of all people, were arguing that the figure did not adequately disclose past suffering as a consequence of climate change. Now, this from a nation who 10 years ago was trying to dispute climate change. And they were very emotive in their representations. And it was very interesting to see how countries have moved on. Every now and then we hit a real brick wall, and nobody would quite find out how to proceed. One country would say, we insist on this and we can't accept that other thing. Another country would say the reverse. Occasionally, we'd have brokerage. For example, Austria, where they played an amazing role in breaking deadlocks. They came up with some very centrist perspectives that helped the discussion forward. But every now and then we'd hit a brick wall. And then they would have huddles. People would be sent away for a day to come back. Or as pressure increased, we couldn't afford to send them away for a day, so they gathered at the back of the room. And this was one that got particularly vocal and loud, and the rest of the discussion sort of stopped and everybody looked around and started taking pictures of them. Because there was a contention. And fortunately, we had Prachari, the chair of the IPCC, and Thomas Stocker, chair of Working Group 1, were there. So every now and then, Chris Field, who's chair of Working Group 2, would say, Dr. Prachari, would you mind taking these countries to the back of the room and sorting it out? Not quite in those words, but, and they would play a brokerage role. And they would come back and say, okay, we've come some language that we think we can accept, compromise on, and it was a case of compromise. Now, the bottom right figure is really just to give you a sense of how it actually works. The text goes up on the screen. And the section that's discussed line by line, and the section or the sentence under consideration is left in clear, so it's the white sentence in the middle. And the chairman will say, this is open for discussion. And then we'd have discussion backwards and forwards. People would raise their flags, and very polite diplomatic language, Mr. Chairman, we cannot accept this. Or, Mr. Chairman, we really like this, or whatever the case may be. And it would go forward sometimes over an hour on a sentence. Other times we'd bang through them quite quickly. Eventually it'd come up to the chairman and would say, we think we're converging on a solution of the language, and we put this forward for approval. Any further discussion, any comments? No. Up for approval. Nobody raises their flag, and he gabbles it down, and it goes green. And once it's gabbled down, nobody can change it. It's accepted. It's a unanimous government acceptance of that statement. We had one case where, I think it was St. Lucia, who had a delegation of one, went to the bathroom. And they gabbled down a sentence, and they came back, and they said, Mr. Chairman, we want to make a comment on this. No further comment, so they lost out on that one. And so it goes forward, and then the next sentence is opened up. And you work through it, sentence by sentence. The entire report, which is, 30, 40 pages, goes through like that. So it's a tortuous process, very long-winded. So this is the one figure that really caused consternation, and I just wanted to point out the sort of things that why. So the thermometer on the right-hand side and the thermometer on the left-hand side, you'll notice are actually just shifted by 0.61 degrees. They're the same. It reflects a baseline change. So the upper gray line reflects a baseline from which the anomalies are calculated, and that's the baseline of 1986 to 2005, which is the baseline that Working Group 1 used. And of course, pre-1986 to 2005, any anomalies are going to be negative. That's why the left one goes to a negative 0.61. The right-hand temperature graph came about because it wasn't there originally. And a couple of nations said, we dispute this. We don't accept that that baseline is the right baseline. We want to see a baseline relevant to pre-industrial temperatures, because otherwise you're hiding all the suffering that's already occurred. And it was an interesting perspective coming out, and so eventually we agreed to have that thermometer on the right-hand side, which is simply a shifted baseline. So you can take the left-hand one or the right-hand one. And then we had horizontal lines at 2 degrees and 4 degrees, because those are two politically relevant temperature thresholds. But then the small island states, we want one at 1.5 degrees. And so now we had 3 lines there, and then suddenly we had lots of lines there, and eventually we just got rid of all the lines. And that's how the discussion goes, but it's pointing out that it's not a discussion about the science. It's a discussion about how the science is being communicated. And as I say, that's a mind shift in the governments. And then just a last figure, just coming back to my chapter, chapter 21, this is the sort of thing that we were trying to do, take the physical science messages and some of the social science messages about migration and other issues, and put a regional context about it for interpretation. And so, for example, on the bottom there, one of the messages that would come out is not so much the point-wise specific temperature, but continents are warming more than oceans. And so when you look at the middle plume diagram and you pull off a global temperature change of, say, 2 degrees, well, over the continents, that's very different. And over the oceans, it's very different. And depending on which emission scenario you follow, on the left-hand side, some regions are warming less than the global mean. But you go to the right-hand side, and you get this nonlinear amplification of it. And then the top panel is just the historical change. So you can see everywhere is warming. And so bringing context and then helping people interpret that for the regions. And I'll finish on that, as I'll go into stories that I probably shouldn't be telling. So.